The girl was called Clara Mayfield, and by the time the dust storms learned her name, she'd already lost everything worth praying for. Her mother lay buried beneath a cottonwood tree behind their burned-out shack. Her two younger brothers vanished into the cruelty of the frontier, and her father, once a broken man trying to survive, had become the very thing the devil would shake hands with. The West did that to people. It hollowed them out, scraped the good clean off their bones, and left only hunger behind. Clara was 18 when her father traded her labor to his drinking companions to settle debts he could never repay. Men who smelled of whiskey and rot. Men who believed silence was something they could buy. No touch was ever described, no words spoken aloud, but Clara learned quickly that fear did not need a voice to be loud. She worked, cooked, cleaned, and endured nights that never seemed to end, her soul shrinking while the prairie stars watched without mercy. The ranch that became her prison squatted like a scar on the land. Broken fences, cattle half dead from neglect, men laughing too loud, too often. Clara survived by becoming invisible, by memorizing footsteps and moods, by counting breaths until morning. She told herself that survival was resistance, that every sunrise meant she had won another battle. But even the strongest will bend when hope is starved long enough. One night, as thunder rolled over the plains, Clara fled barefoot into the rain, running until her lungs burned and her blood mixed with mud. She collapsed near a riverbank, certain death would be kinder than going back. That was where Eli Walker found her. Eli was a rancher carved from grief and grit, a man whose silence carried weight. He had buried a wife years earlier and learned that justice in the West was something you had to make with your own hands. When he saw Clara shaking in the rain, he did not ask questions. He wrapped her in his coat, lifted her like she weighed nothing, and took her home. No demands, no expectations, just shelter. Over time, Clara spoke in pieces about fire, about hunger, about men who smiled too easily. Eli listened, and every word she shared sharpened something dark inside him. When Eli finally rode to that ranch, he did not come as a savior. He came as reckoning. One by one, the men who had destroyed Clara's family faced the consequences of their choices, not in cruelty, but in finality. The West had laws, but it also had justice, and sometimes they were not the same thing. By dawn, the ranch stood silent, and the wind carried the truth farther than any confession ever could. At the edge of the property, Eli burned the debt ledger and left Clara's father alive, forced to live with what he had done, which was a harsher punishment than death. Clara watched the flames rise, feeling something inside her finally loosen. For the first time since childhood, she slept without fear. And if this story moved you, if justice stories like this matter to you, subscribe to the channel, because some stories deserve to be told until the truth can no longer hide. Healing did not come all at once. It arrived slowly, like dawn over a wounded land. Clara stayed at Eli's ranch, not as a burden, not as a debt, but as family. She learned horses, learned how to shoot straight, learned that strength could exist without cruelty. The nightmares faded, replaced by mornings filled with work that meant something and silence that felt safe. Eli never claimed credit for what he had done. He believed the land itself had demanded balance, and he had simply listened. Word spread, as it always did in the West. Some called Eli a killer. Others called him a hero. Clara called him the man who reminded her she was human. Together, they rebuilt what had been broken, not just fences and barns, but belief. Clara took back her name, her voice, her future. She no longer flinched at loud laughter. She no longer feared the dark. The past remained, but it no longer owned her. Years later, travelers would speak of a ranch where no man went hungry and no woman lived in fear. They would say justice lived there, not the kind written on paper, but the kind earned in blood and mercy alike. And Clara would smile, knowing that survival had become something greater than endurance. It had become purpose. If you believe stories of strength, justice, and redemption deserve a place in this world, subscribe to the channel, because every voice matters, and some stories refuse to stay. Buried, peace in the West never arrived quietly. It crept in like a cautious animal, testing the ground before trusting it. For Clara, the days after justice were filled with small victories that once would have seemed impossible, sleeping through the night, laughing without fear, standing tall when strangers rode past. Eli's ranch became more than land and livestock. It became a place where broken things were not thrown away, but rebuilt with patience and sweat. Clara worked beside Eli, not because she owed him anything, but because purpose felt better than survival ever had. The sun burned her skin, the rains toughened her hands, and each day carved strength into her bones. But the past, like a bad debt, always tried to collect. Rumors drifted in from nearby towns, whispers of men asking questions, of lawmen who cared less about truth and more about order. The rancher who had taken justice into his own hands was becoming a story, and stories in the West had a way of drawing guns. Clara felt it first, that tightening in her chest when unfamiliar riders appeared on the horizon. Eli felt it too, though he said nothing. He had never expected forgiveness, only balance. And balance always came at a price. The men arrived at dusk, badges catching the last light, horses restless beneath them. They spoke of law, of consequences, of order. Eli listened without argument. Clara stood on the porch, heart pounding, but she did not hide. When the lead marshal accused Eli of murder, Clara stepped forward and told her story, not in tears, not in rage, but in truth. She spoke of fire, hunger, betrayal, and silence. She spoke of a world where the law arrived too late and left too early. Her voice did not shake. The marshal hesitated. The West was changing, but slowly, and some men still understood that justice was not always clean. In the end, they left with warnings instead of chains. Eli watched them go, knowing that this was not an ending, only a turning point. Months passed. The land healed. Clara began helping other lost souls who found their way to the ranch. Widows, runaways, men broken by war or whiskey. She discovered that her strength could become shelter for others, just as Eli's had been for her. She was no longer the girl who ran barefoot through the rain. She was a woman who stood her ground. One evening, as the prairie sky burned orange and gold, Clara realized something quietly powerful. The men who had destroyed her family no longer haunted her dreams. They had lost their hold. Justice had not erased the past, but it had freed the future. Eli never asked for gratitude. He only nodded when Clara told him she planned to stay, to build something lasting from the ashes. Together, they watched the sun sink below the horizon, knowing the West would always be harsh, but it would never own them again. And if stories of courage, justice, and redemption speak to you, subscribe to the channel, because some stories don't just entertain, they remind us who we can become.